I took a management job in the Dinosaur feeding division, and 4 hours later the system stopped calling me a manager. It started calling me a local body. On the screen, that looked like a status change. In cargo, with the route lights amber and reinforced glass ahead of me, it meant something else. By the time I understood what East Feed Transit was, I was alone beside the wrong chain, close enough to hear a prehistoric animal move behind the barrier. And the software had already decided my personnel status was not route relevant. You can tell a lot about how serious a system thinks it is by the quality of the euphemisms it builds around blood. I did not know that on the drive in. At the time, I was watching rain slide across the windshield and trying to remember which service gate my confirmation packet had told me to use. The packet said I had been promoted into management, and it said that with the kind of polished gravity usually reserved for aerospace and cults. Paleosustenance Transfer Manager. Not feed manager. Not receiving lead. Not livestock logistics. Paleosustenance. The word made the work sound cleaner than it was. What moved through that building was cattle, poultry, chilled inventory, process chain, transfer documentation, and enough living supply to feed animals no guest brochure wanted to imagine eating. I had worked distribution before. Not here. Not at this scale. But enough places like this to have developed the ordinary professional delusions that competence mattered, that systems were most legible at the operational level, and that patient procedural work could make almost any workflow reveal its shape eventually. Those delusions are useful early in a career. They help you keep your posture straight while bigger machines decide what kind of person you are. I was proud enough of the promotion to mistake that posture for readiness. Receiving Annex C sat beyond the guest-facing roads, past 2 service turns and a security island where the landscaping stopped pretending to be scenic. By the time I parked, the public parts of R Epoch were behind me. My predecessor was waiting beneath the annex lights in a high-visibility shell with the reflective strips half-peeled at the wrists and shoulders, as if the jacket had spent too many years learning corners faster than the human inside it. Behind him, 6 refrigerated trailers idled in the rain-bright lot. 2 live-haul units sat farther back, with more space around them than the other vehicles got. "Voss?" he asked, without looking down at the tablet tucked under his arm. I said yes. Simon Voss, at that point still sounding like the sort of name that belonged to a man whose job would remain local and countable. He lifted his eyes from the tablet and looked me over once, not critically, just efficiently, as if confirming I had arrived with the correct number of limbs for the start of a shift. "Good," he said. "You're on time." That's helpful. That made me feel, briefly, as if I had already passed the first test. There are men who make you trust them because they seem warm, and men who make you trust them because they seem tired in the exact places experience tends to gather. He was the second kind. Late 50s, maybe early 60s if the job had been kind to him, and older if it had not. Narrow face. Pale brows. A nose that had either been broken once or had simply grown resentful over time. His badge said Mo. Dana, which gave me a surname and an initial and nothing else, the institutional compromise between familiarity and replaceability. At the first door, he stopped long enough to hold out his hand. Mine disappeared inside it for a second and came back with the impression that he still believed in grip strength as a way of verifying character. "Marlowe," he said, either noticing the flick of my eyes to the badge or deciding formal introduction was, for one evening, affordable. He pressed his badge to the reader and waited for the light to change. "Tonight's my last night, which means by this time tomorrow, this is your headache." "Congratulations," I said. The reader clicked green. He did not open the door right away. He gave me a look I would later learn meant "do not flatter me with interpretations I have not requested." That's one word for it. The compact transfer rig beside the live haul units carried R Epoch's public mark on the side, bronze linework, elegant skeletonized R, the whole expensive doctrine of thoughtful extinction. Above the annex, the main lighting was white and functional. Lower down, along the personnel doors and controlled route barriers, everything softened into amber. The color sat on the wet concrete like old varnish. Even the back-of-house areas here had to remind you they belonged to a destination, not merely an organism. One of the live hall units shifted once on its suspension while we stood there, not enough to alarm anyone, just enough to make rainwater tremble in the shallow depressions of the lot. The air smelled like rain on hot concrete, wet cardboard, diesel, disinfectant, and the faint ferrous trace of something I chose, at that point, to classify as normal industrial life. Under it, from the live hall side, came a warmer breath of wet straw and animal heat that did not fit with the word inventory. "You do receiving?" Marlowe asked as we crossed the painted pedestrian lane toward the entrance. "Regional cold chain before this. Some live transfer overlap, but not specialty intake." I wanted that to sound competent. I also wanted it to be enough. "Good," he said. "Cold chain teaches you paperwork lies in interesting ways." A door sealed behind us with a rubber thump. I wasn't sure whether that was meant as a joke. The first personnel door had taken us out of the rain and into a narrow vestibule that smelled of rubber seals and old mop water. The second opened into warmer air and a low mechanical hum. At the third barrier, clean black lettering over amber backlight read "Local Authorization Only." Marlowe did not slow down, but he watched me read it. The corridor beyond opened into an administrative pocket with reinforced glass on one side. He paused there and let me look down. Below us, the receiving floor moved with controlled motion, pallet jacks, sealed grey bins, 2 workers in white sanitation shells rinsing a ribbed transfer cradle, forklifts making careful turns under scanner arms. Water hissed off the cradle's metal ribs and ran pinkish into the floor drain before the disinfectant foam swallowed the color. From above, the place did not look dramatic, which is how dangerous industrial systems prefer to look. "You're lucky," Marlowe said. "In what sense?" "You start on handoff instead of normal intake. Means you'll get words before volume. That's usually kinda." I glanced through the glass. Below us, a line of crate modules moved under scanner arms toward a staging lane marked PST North Receive, while another route split south toward chilled processing. Overhead displays updated in little pulses. Chain 4 ACC appetted. Chain 4A hold, chain 7 delayed. The displays looked orderly from above. That was part of their trick. Without context, the updates had the harmless rhythm of weather reports. "How much of this is mine?" I asked. Marlowe made a dry sound through his nose. "Depends how much you like the truth in layers." "Officially, you supervise Paleosustenance Transfer receiving, local staging, and chain integrity confirmation for this annex." He started walking again. "In practice, you supervise the part of the machine they believe a local manager can know without becoming expensive." That might have worried me more if he had sounded theatrical saying it. He didn't. He sounded like a man explaining weather while checking whether the roof had already started to leak. His office, if you were generous enough to call it that, was a raised control room with 2 desks, 3 wall monitors, a route board, a floor map, too dense to read at first glance, and the kind of institutional coffee machine that made every drink taste faintly of hot policy. One desk had already been streaked almost clean. The other had a stack of transfer binders, 2 tablets in charging docks, and a legal pad filled with blocky handwriting that looked more like inventory marks than sentences. The room smelled different from the corridor: burnt coffee, warm electronics, printer toner, and the thin metallic breath of the ventilation system pushing floor air through filters that were doing their best. Marlowe pointed toward the stripped desk. "That's your side as of midnight." "Ceremonial." "Nothing here is ceremonial. That's part of the problem." He shrugged out of the shell and hung it on the back of the chair. Underneath, he wore a grey uniform shirt with no visible insignia except his clipped credential and a patch at the upper sleeve I hadn't seen in the onboarding materials. Paleosustenance Transfer I stage. Beneath that, smaller. Local chain only. I noticed him, noticing me, Notice it. That matters, he said. The local chain part. More than most things here. If you remember one sentence tonight, remember that one. Local chain only. He said it without emphasis, which gave it more. I set my bag down beside the desk and looked again through the glass at the floor below. One of the live haul units had backed into receiving gate 2. Personnel were already moving around it with practice speed, clipboards, scanners. Controlled gate caution, the small careful distances workers leave around equipment that can become animal adjacent faster than the paperwork admits. Nothing about their posture looked unusual, which, at the time, reassured me. What's the actual split here? I asked. Meaning, how much comes through live, how much through chilled, how much through processed chain? Depends what day. What chain state, what adjacent divisions pretending not to be adjacent this week? Ballpark. Ballpark is for guest maps. He sat, tapped his badge against the tablet dock, and brought up a set of dashboards. Intake volume, chain routing, local holds, environmental status, transfer compliance. The interface used colors as if colors were explanations: amber, green, white, the occasional blue. Very little red visible at this level. You like numbers? He asked. Enough to work here, apparently. Bad answer. Everybody likes numbers until the numbers start developing opinions. I smiled, because again, I wasn't sure if he was joking, and because new jobs train you to place politeness ahead of comprehension for at least the first hour. He did not smile back. Here's your local reality, he said, tapping the left monitor. You receive transfer chains. You confirm weight, condition, route status, and destination validity within Annex Authority. You do not certify downstream totalization. You do not reconcile parallel chain gaps outside local receipt unless specifically tasked by upper routing. You do not make exposure assumptions from volume. That last one caught slyly. Exposure assumptions? Fed population assumptions. Same category family. Different problem if you say the wrong one in the wrong room. I pulled out the chair and sat. Why would I be making fed population assumptions from receiving volume? Marlowe looked at me for a moment with an expression I would, by the end of the night, come to hate. Not contempt. Recognition of a familiar mistake. Because every new manager thinks the same thing, he said. You see enough incoming mass, enough routed chain, enough differential hold, and sooner or later you decide the numbers should tell you how big the system is. Shouldn't they? He leaned back. No. They should tell you how big the part is that they are willing to let one node believe in. Below us, the dock alarm at Gate 2 chirps twice. Workers move to either side as the transfer cradle lowered into position. On the north wall display, Chain 4A hold became Chain 4A. The cradle settled with a heavy mechanical sigh that I felt through the soles of my shoes before I thought about what was being held in place. Marlowe glanced at the display and did not seem surprised. See that? What is it? Depends who you ask. Who am I allowed to ask? That got the first thing close to a smile out of him all evening. Small and not especially friendly. Better. That's a manager question. He stood and came around behind me, pointing not at the hold itself, but at 3 narrow columns to the right that I would have missed on my own because they looked like reference metadata rather than active operational truth. Saw to as Kane. Family confirmable within local authority. Under the last column, against Chain 4A, one entry blinked. No. You are going to be tempted, he said, to think no means someone above you knows and just isn't telling you. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes it means the truth is spread sideways instead of upward. That's worse. Spread sideways? Parallel managers. Adjacent receives. Split route staging. Off-book wording. Depends what state the machine is in and how much elegance they want around it tonight. He returned to his chair and opened one of the binders. The tabs were color-coded by something more complex than date or vendor. Some sections were labeled in plain industrial terms. Leave receive, cold chain, bulk protein, sanitary return, while others were less honest. Herbivore program supports specialty feed, chain, non-standard nutritive transfer. Those are terrible names, I said before I could stop myself. Yes. They're all saying different things in the same accent. Now you're learning. He slid the binder toward me and tapped 2 sections with one finger. This one and this one are the same until they aren't. This one and this one are different until somebody in routing needs them to rhyme. If you apply receiving logic from one family to the wrong transfer state, you'll still sound intelligent while you get the answer wrong. I flipped through a few pages. The procedures were written in the familiar administrative style of all large systems: short commands, layered subclauses, exception notes pretending not to be more important than the rule they interrupted. But he was right. The language shifted by degrees so small they looked accidental until you lined the pages up side by side. Confirm condition before state release, confirm status before route release, confirm viability before handoff release. Same sentence skeleton. Different nouns. Different consequences. Who writes these? I asked. Departments protecting themselves from one another. That answer was too fast to be improvisation. Outside the office, one of the wall lights over the north floor pulsed from amber to white and back. A local review state apparently, because nobody below reacted with urgency. 2 workers rerouted the held chain into a side-staging lane screened by movable partitions. I could see only glimpses through the shifting gaps, sealed container edges, condensation vapor, scanner wash. The whole movement took less than a minute. It was quiet enough to look routine and coordinated enough to make routine feel like another kind of warning. What exactly are we receiving in 4A? I asked. Marlowe looked down at the pad on his desk instead of at the live display. Not your first useful question, he said, but close. What was the first? He tore a page from the pad and handed it over. On it were 6 numbers in his blocky hand, written one under another with no labels. 14, 14, 13, 16, 14, 12. What am I looking at? I asked. My final month of trying to be stupid in a disciplined way. That doesn't help. It's not supposed to. It tells you where the itch started. I looked from the numbers to him and back. Counts. Local visible managers attached to what should have been one coherent family of sustenance receipt, depending on the week, the route posture, and who was willing to admit they were doing adjacent work. Visible managers, I repeated. That's the key word. How many are there really? He spread his hands slightly. If I knew that, I wouldn't be retiring with a packet and a non-disparagement clause. The packet I already knew about. It had been mentioned twice in HR handoff language as though voluntary retirement were a lifestyle package one might add to a premium subscription. The non-disparagement clause was new. You signed one? I signed enough paper to remain employable in the future and unharmed in the present. That is usually how these things work. He took the page back before I could ask for it and folded it once, neatly, then tucked it under the binder. Do not become fascinated by manage accounts, he said. That's not advice I expect you to follow. It's just still the advice. What happened when you tried to close it? Nothing dramatic. That's the style here. No one dragged me out. No one threatened me in a parking structure. My access started getting cleaner. He paused. Cleaner is almost always worse. Mess means you're still touching something real. Once your routes get simplified and your questions start receiving beautiful answers, you're already being moved away from the thing you were asking. I looked back at the North Floor display. Hain for a review had become Shane for a interanal. No explanation attached. Does that happen often? I asked. Often enough that if you keep score, you'll stop sleeping. Not often enough that they can't tell you its normal variance. A silence followed that, not hostile, just occupied. Below us, the floor kept moving. Pallets. Scanners. Route lights. Paperwork in motion. A machine large enough to create its own weather and small enough, from this office, to pass for management. Marlowe opened the second tablet and slid it toward me. All right, he said. Local chain first. Forget the metaphysics for 5 minutes and learn the part that can still kill your job before the larger thing kills your peace of mind. He began with receiving states, then staging authority, then the difference between transfer confirmation and destination assumption, which sounded pedantic until he walked me through 3 examples where the same incoming weight and source class could legally move into 3 entirely different chains depending on who had annotated the prior handoff and which neighboring family claimed visibility rights. It took me 40 minutes to understand the surface. Another 20 to realize the surface might have been designed to be understandable precisely so I wouldn't notice the rest. By then the live haul unit at Gate 2 had cleared, the North Review lane had sealed, and 2 more transfer alerts had appeared on the board in categories I had not been trained on yet. Chain 9. Specialty hold Chain 12 reclassify pending. Marlowe watched me notice them. "No," he said. "I didn't say anything." "You thought something." "Same problem. When do I get trained on specialty and reclassify?" "Not tonight." "When?" He looked through the glass, rather than at me. "Depends how long they want your world to stay local." That should have sounded dramatic. Instead, it sounded tired. Which was worse. He stood and reached for his shell. "Come on," he said. "Walk the floor. If you're going to inherit a lie, you should at least know what it smells like up close." I followed him out of the office and down the metal stairs into the annex proper. Each step took us out of the filtered control room air and closer to the working mixture below. Refrigeration breath, animal residue, hot hydraulics, bleach, wet straw, thawing protein, and the industrial dignity of things nobody in guest-facing literature ever admits are necessary. The floor was louder at body level. Scanner tones crossed with hose noise and forklift reverse beeps. Workers moved around us without seeming to hurry, but the gaps they left were exact. He led me past receiving lanes, sealed bins, wash stations, scanner towers, and a side corridor marked Transfer ACCess Local ECCCOCCR Phone. I noticed it because the wording was almost familiar from the binder and not quite. Local escort only. Not local chain only. Not to local authorization. Close enough to borrow your confidence if you were tired. Marlowe saw me reading it. "That's how they get you," he said. "Who?" He looked at the sign, then at the floor beyond it where a pair of workers in dark shells guided a narrow cart through a badge gate I didn't have line of sight into. "Nobody in particular," he said. "That's the trick." Then he kept walking, and I went with him because it was still my first night, because he was still the man handing me the building, and because I had not yet learned the difference between a warning and the beginning of an education. On most industrial floors, the first hour tells you whether the people running the place believe in process or habit. At Paleosustenance Transfer, the answer was both, and the combination made me uneasy faster than either one alone would have. The visible routines were disciplined enough to impress auditors and old enough to have developed instincts. Forklifts moved exactly where they were meant to, until some minor exception required a human gesture, and then the human gesture took over with the confidence of something the written process had long ago learned to tolerate without admitting. Scanner towers read crate tags in narrow white bands. Route panels updated in neat pulses. Workers called confirmation states to one another in clipped phrases that sounded standardized right up until you listened closely enough to notice that different lanes clipped the same phrases differently. At floor level, the building stopped feeling like an office view and became a sequence of moving clearances. Painted walk lanes. Wet concrete. Steel postguards scarred at shin height. Amber outlights reflected in the water left by washdown hoses. Every sound had a place in the system until it did not. Marlowe walked me through receiving gates 2 through 6 at a pace that suggested he had given this tour before, and hated himself a little each time for discovering how much of it he could perform from memory. Live chain first, then protein staging, then chilled transfer, then local root board, he said. By the time most new managers think they got the floor, they've actually just learned how to stand in the right places while the floor decides what to let them see. That sounded too elegant to be accidental. Did you practice that? I asked. No. I repeated it enough times that it wore a groove. We stopped beside receiving lane 4 where a sealed transfer chain sat under review lights, white at the tower, amber at the floor edge, one small blue state marker blinking at the base of the scanner arm. The containers were modular, stainless, and condensed over. Each one was tagged with routing slips inside clear sleeves that faced away from the main aisle, as though the paperwork itself had privacy needs. A floor lead named Ramirez met us there with a tablet tucked under one arm and a high-vis shell open over a dark utility shirt. He had the steady posture of someone who had learned to save hurry for emergencies that deserved it. 4A still soft-locked? Marlowe asked. Ramirez nodded once. Soft until North resolves visibility claim. That phrase went by quickly enough that I almost missed how little it resembled the language from the office display. Visibility claim, I asked. Ramirez looked at me, then at Marlowe. New manager, Marlowe said. That explained me to him in the only terms that mattered. Receiving visibility, Ramirez said. Not destination visibility. What's the difference? Ramirez blinked as if the answer were obvious, and then, to his credit, realized that obviousness was always local. Receiving visibility means we can verify what crossed into chain custody. Destination visibility means the next family acknowledges where it's actually entering. Not the same thing. It sounds like they should be the same thing. That'd be nice, he said. Marlowe glanced at me without smiling. That'd be nice I was beginning to understand, one of the few honest institutional dialects left in the building. Ramirez keyed something into his tablet, and the blue state marker at the base of the scanner changed to amber. Not resolved. Merely moved. The container line stayed where it was, beads of condensation collecting along the lower seams and dropping one by one onto the painted lane. Who has North claim right now? Marlowe asked. Ramirez shrugged one shoulder. Depends what level you mean that question at. There it was again. Everybody in this place seemed able to answer only by first deciding what altitude a sentence belonged to. Marlowe took me on without pausing. That's your first practical lesson, he said as we crossed toward the protein staging lanes. Questions here almost always contain 2 or 3 versions of themselves. If you don't know which one you're asking, somebody else will choose for you. And they'll choose the safest one. Not safest. Cheapest. There's a difference. We moved past a wash station where 2 sanitation workers were breaking down a transfer cradle with hoses and foaming chemical spray. The foam gathered in seams before sliding toward a grated drain, carrying with it little gray threads of residue I decided not to inspect. Beyond them, a palletized chilled chain sat under temporary thermal wrap, awaiting release to an adjacent family I had not been cleared to see yet. The wrap crackled under the airflow like something breathing through plastic. Overhead signage marked the split with the same language habits I'd already begun to resent. Local stage adjacent receive condrit. Same rhythm. Same institutional confidence. 3 entirely different promises. You said not to make Fed population assumptions from receiving volume, I said. Marlowe nodded. So tell me the clean version of why. There isn't a clean version. Then tell me the useful one. He slowed. That, more than anything he had said so far, felt like progress. Fine, he said. Useful version. Incoming volume here does not correspond 1-to-1 with downstream fed state. Because of processing loss? Partly. Diversion? Sometimes. Storage. If you're lucky. He stopped beside a route board set into a concrete column and tapped the lower left quadrant with one knuckle. The board sat behind scratched protective glass, bright enough to look authoritative and smudged enough to remind you how many hands had needed it to be true. A cluster of chains flickered there under headings I knew and headings I did not. Local herb support. Non-standard nutritive chain. Divert. Fromite. You see those family labels? He asked. Yes. Now tell me if you think those all describe product destination or legal defensibility. I looked at him. That's not a fair question. Good. You're awake. He tapped non-standard nutritive. New people read that and think special diet, exotic intake, boutique nonsense. Maybe sometimes. But more often it means somebody needed a chain family broad enough to move under multiple interpretations without rewriting 3 departments worth of paperwork. That sounds unstable. It is stable for the people who invented it, not always for the people standing near it. We walked on. At Gate 5, a live haul unit backed into place with the slow hydraulic humility of very large things trying to persuade you they were safe. The reverse tone pulsed through the floor and into my knees. I watched floor staff receive it in layers: route confirmation, lock verification, environmental check, 2 signatures, 1 scanner pass. Then a moment where nothing happened at all because everyone present was waiting on some remote acknowledgement, none of them personally controlled. The pause did more to tighten the room than any alarm could have. Workers kept their positions. Nobody leaned on the unit. Nobody stood where the rear lock line might swing if something inside shifted wrong. How many people can hold 1 incoming chain? I asked. Define hold. Delay, freeze, review, softlock, reclassify, whatever vocabulary family we're using for ordinary obstruction. Marlowe grunted. Potentially. Half the machine. In practice? Enough that if you're waiting for 1 answer from 1 person, you've already misunderstood the architecture. The phrase landed harder than most because it matched something I had felt before I could articulate it, that the system's true shape might not be vertical at all, not in the clean hierarchy sense. Not chain of command. More like braided local authorities connected by terms they all pretended meant the same thing for morale. I said as much, or some rough version of it, while we stood between the Gate 5 lock line and a stack of sealed grey bins labelled for 3 different destination families. Marlowe glanced at me sidelong. You're educated enough to become difficult, he said. Try not to make that my parting gift. It was the first line all night that carried actual warmth, or something near enough to it that I felt my shoulders loosen before I remembered not to trust relief too quickly. We returned to the office just before midnight break. The stairwell back up was narrow, metal, and louder than it needed to be, each step ringing under our boots. Through the mesh rail, I could still see Gate 5 holding its positions below, the live haul unit now fixed to the dock like an animal pretending to be a trailer. When we reached the control room, Chain 4A was still unresolved, though its state had changed again. Chain 4A. Internal had become Chain 4A 5 verified, not locally actionable. I stared at it. That's absurd. Marlowe set his shell on the chair and came to stand beside me. Yes. Verified by whom? Somebody with the right to make that sentence true. Not locally actionable by whom? You are improving. No, seriously. He folded his arms and watched the board with me. That's the sentence that starts changing people, he said. Because it tells you something is real but not yours. Because it tells you something is real, in motion, and close enough to touch the edge of your responsibility while remaining structurally inaccessible from where you're standing. Some people can live with that. Some start counting. I looked at him. Which kind were you? He didn't answer immediately. Below us, a forklift turned, reversed, and slid a sealed chain into chilled holding with the precision of a machine pretending not to be one. The white shell of the container passed under scanner light, then disappeared behind a partition that closed too smoothly for anything so industrial. I started counting because counting is what sensible men do when language goes soft around them, he said at last. You tell yourself quantity will be more honest. You tell yourself volume doesn't care about brand strategy. You tell yourself mass doesn't lie. And? He reached for the legal pad again, tore off another sheet, and set it in front of me. This time the page had 3 columns. No headings. Just dates, intake weights, and final numbers circled at the bottom of each week. The weekly totals were inconsistent in ways that didn't behave like ordinary spoilage or route variation. Not wildly. That would have been easier. Subtly. Enough to plausibly explain away if each week lived alone. Enough to start itching if you were the kind of person who lined weeks up next to one another. I remember not wanting to touch the page, which was foolish. It was only paper. But it felt, in that moment, like accepting it would make the numbers mine. These are local receives, I asked. Local visible receives. Over what period? 6 weeks before I learned to stop doing this in a building that might someday search drawers. I ran the numbers quickly. Not exact arithmetic, just professional feel. Enough intake volume moving through our visible chain family that even conservative downstream assumptions should have implied more stable burden than the local labels suggested. Not proof of a hidden menagerie. Not anything that clean. But enough to make the categories look suspiciously decorative. Could be parallel support, I said. Yes. Could be hidden cold chain storage. Sometimes. Could be adjacent family bleed. Often. Could be accounting slop. If you're very lucky. There it was, again. Luck as a synonym for a smaller truth. I set the page down. What made you think there were more managers? Marlowe sat and leaned back slowly enough that the chair complained before he did. Dock patterns. Access windows. Who got called when something went soft? Which office lights were on at hours that didn't belong to our shift? How many times I heard a sentence starting with your counterpart in North Support from people who could never quite tell me where North Support sat on a map. And you never found out? I found too many partial answers. That's different. He looked over at the stripped desk that would be mine after midnight. One of the tricks here is that they don't need to hide everything. They just have to keep any one node from proving the whole. Much cheaper. Much cleaner. Everybody beneath a certain threshold gets enough truth to perform, and not enough to totalize. I did not say anything for a moment because the sentence had lodged somewhere deeper than I wanted to admit. Probably because it fit. Probably because the floor below us, seen from this office, already looked exactly like that kind of machine. What happens if someone does try to totalize? I asked. He shrugged. Depends how useful they still are. That answer was too smooth. Not improvised. Not speculative. A line with history on it. Before I could push further, the right wall monitor chimed and a small root state alert appeared in the upper corner. Time 12, reclassify pending temporization. Marlowe went still in a way I had not seen from him yet. Not fully through. Calibration. The control room seemed to notice with him. The hum of the monitors, the distant scanner tones, the coffee machine warming itself pointlessly in the corner. None of it changed, and all of it suddenly sounded too loud. That's not ours, I said. No, not at first. Then why are we seeing it? He crossed to the monitor and keyed into a lower-level visibility pane that should, by all visible labeling, have been disabled at our authority level. Because somebody routed the request through the wrong family, he said. Accidentally? You ask that like those are still different worlds. The pane expanded for less than a second before access stripped itself back. In that second, I saw only fragments, a root branch I hadn't been shown, a transfer flag in red instead of amber, and one line of chain notation that did not resemble any category Marlowe had walked me through. PST/Khan AUX live. Then it vanished. Marlowe removed his hand from the controls very slowly. Did you see that? I asked. No, he said. It was the first lie he told me all night. Not because I could prove it. Because the room still held the shape of his attention. What's Khan AUX? He picked up his shell. Not your lame. That isn't an answer. It is if you want to keep your first night pleasantly provincial. He started toward the stairs. I followed him because new managers follow older ones, even when instinct has already begun drafting objections. On the landing, he stopped and looked back at me. Simon, he said. The use of my first name startled me more than the alert had. Yes? You need to decide early what kind of trouble your mind likes. Some men like visible trouble. Breaks, leaks, contamination, screaming, things you can point at and survive by being quicker. Other men like pattern trouble. Missing volume. Wrong language. Counters that don't agree with one another. The second kind gets into deeper water here because the system can tolerate a visible mistake. What it dislikes is synthesis. He let that sit between us. The stairwell smelled of damped metal and disinfectant, and through the mesh below us a transfer alarm chirped once, not urgent enough to interrupt him, and not calm enough to ignore. Then he added almost gently, "And don't go near cargo because you think cargo is the truth. Cargo is just where the truth changes vehicles." Below us, in the annex proper, a transfer alarm chirped again. Not urgent. Not calm either. On the board behind him, Shane 12 Reglassosophy pending had already disappeared, which meant either the problem had been solved or the version of the problem available to us had been withdrawn. By then I already knew which possibility I found more disturbing. The trouble with learning a system from a tired man is that fatigue makes honesty look casual. If Marlowe had sat me down in the office and said, "Listen carefully, this place is segmented in ways that make ordinary accountability impossible," I might have treated it like veteran bitterness, the kind every large workplace produces once enough years have passed through the same badge. Instead, he kept handing me pieces too practical to dismiss. A word here, a boundary there, one local distinction after another, until the distinctions themselves began to imply a larger shape no one was naming. We spent the next hour in what he called the soft middle. The phrase sounded like one of his jokes until we reached it. The soft middle was not one room but a run of narrower corridors and prep spaces between the annex proper and transfer. The kind of zone designed so no department could be accused of owning the whole passage. "Not receiving, not transfer," he said as we crossed through another badge gate into a corridor lined with chilled prep bays and sealed root alcoves. The gate closed behind us with a soft pneumatic sigh. Middle spaces are where language gets defensive. Receiving still believes in nouns. Transfer believes in outcomes. Middle space has to keep both from suing each other. That was the kind of line you could laugh at if you wanted to keep your mind light. I didn't. Not because it wasn't funny, because by then I had started noticing how often his jokes behaved like welded repairs over pressure cracks. The soft middle smelled different from the annex proper. Less live-hall heat, more refrigeration, chemical foam, protein thaw, and the faint sweet wrongness of grain or nutrient slurry that had spent too long near war machinery before somebody corrected the problem. The air had a refrigerated bite, but the floor was damp near the drains, and every few yards my shoes crossed from dry sealant into a thin skin of wash water. The bays themselves were modular and over-labeled. Every 5 feet there was another surface explaining, delimiting, or conditionally redefining something. Nocal hold old trans, for hold not in trans. Stager confirmation require destination, confirmation season. Do not infrachain family from package classed. That last one stopped me. Why would anyone infer chain family from package class if the system was designed correctly? Marlowe did not break stride. Because human beings love symmetry and this place profits from almost giving it to them. He badge opened a side alcove and gestured me in. The alcove was barely an office. 2 narrow desks were bolted to the wall beneath a buzzing light panel. A hand sink sat in one corner with a laminated sanitation card above it. The lower edge curled from steam and chemical wipe down. Behind a row of sliding transparent partitions sat 6 sealed staging modules under separate environmental controls. Each module bore the same public mark at the corner and a different lower right code family. Hesup nas cold, arc spec bulk. Similar enough to feel related. Different enough to demand training I had not yet been given. Marlowe keyed his badge into the root terminal and brought up a split-screen display I had not seen upstairs. Left side, current local holds. Right side, family translation notes. This, he said, tapping the right pane, is where sensible people stop trusting their own instincts. The notes were worse than the binders. Not sloppier. Too careful. A matrix of term families with cross-references and exception guidance, each one written in language that sounded as if it had passed through legal operations and 3 different departmental feuds before arriving on the screen. Hold in receiving context did not imply hold in transfer context. Release in staging context did not confer route release. Auxiliary in nutrition context did not equal auxiliary in destination context. Specialty could describe chain handling, destination visibility, or protected intake class depending on which family originated the label. I stared at it for several seconds. "This is insane," I said. "No," Marlowe said. "This is negotiated. There's a difference. It means a person can read the right word and still do the wrong thing. Now you see the appeal." He reached past me and selected one of the translation notes. A subpanel opened. Local managers are not to resolve. Family conflict states by Common-sense terminological assumption. There was a note beneath that, smaller. If uncertain, defer to originating family. If origin is contested, defer upward or lateral per chain visibility rules. Lateral per chain visibility rules, I repeated. There it is again. So if origin is contested, nobody local actually owns the answer. Sometimes nobody local owns the question. He shut the subpanel. I looked over at the staging modules behind the partitions. One was under active cooling and lightly fogged from inside. Condensation beaded on the transparent panel and trembled whenever the vent above it cycled. Another showed an amber root pulse at the base. A third remained dark except for a small state light I couldn't yet pass. "How often do conflicts like this happen?" I asked. "Depends if you're counting formal conflicts or lived ones." "Formal first." He shrugged. "Often enough to justify the matrix. Rare enough that anyone above us can still call it edge case management." "And lived." He turned to face the modules rather than me. "Lived is when everyone on the floor is pretending not to notice that 3 families are using the same container geometry and half the same words, while insisting they are not touching the same machine. That happens every shift." There was no dramatic emphasis on that sentence, no lowering of the voice, no ominous music from the ceiling. Just hardened something hitting that glass. Not at first. Not at first. We can't imagine something hitting that glass. I found that more unsettling than if he had tried to scare me on purpose. A chime sounded from the root terminal. One of the modules, Nutholt, shifted from amber pulse to white static. The light change was small, but the alcove changed with it. Not fully see-through and procedurally. The way a room changes when everyone in it suddenly knows a decision has moved without becoming clear. Marlowe looked immediately. "What does white mean here?" I asked. "In this room? It means someone wants the module to look less alive as a decision than it actually is. That is not a color code. No, it's experience." He keyed into the event log and let me read over his shoulder. Midica / Nutholt local / confirmed destination. Pending visible to Ax Lament. I pointed. Aux claimant again. Different family. Same word. Almost. That almost was becoming the most dangerous word in the building. "Is there an actual reason the terms overlap like this?" I asked. "Many," Marlowe said. "None of them improve your life." He moved us back onto the corridor and through another controlled door that opened onto a mezzanine overlooking what he called secondary staging. The door had a square observation window wired with safety glass, and beyond it the lighting dropped from office white to a lower directional amber that made each lane look narrower than it was. Below, workers moved smaller transfer carts between partitioned lanes. The lighting down there was lower and more directional than in primary receiving, which made every movement look more intentional than it probably was. At the far end of the floor, half obscured by hanging root curtains and scanner poles, I saw 3 shells moving around a narrow cart marked only with conditional bar lights and a chain flag I couldn't read from that distance. The cart's wheels left faint wet arcs on the floor as they turned. What I could read was the lane header above it. Transfer ACSS ASC Core Friend. Not local escort only this time. Zaycourt required. Same rhythm. Different authority. Different implied danger. How many escort families are there? I asked. More than you need. Fewer than the paperwork suggests. That is impossible. Welcome to management. He said it absently, watching the cart below as one of the shell-clad workers scanned in and the others waited. Not frozen. Ready. The kind of readiness people develop when a single correct beep matters more than most spoken sentences. Have you ever been down there? I asked. Marlowe's answer came too fast. Enough. Enough. Not never. Not yes. Enough. Enough. Which meant he had crossed boundaries he now regretted or normalized or both. He led me back upstairs just before 1 in the morning. The office felt warmer after the soft middle, or maybe only more honest in its smallness. The coffee machine still smelled like hot policy. The floorboard had shed some chains and acquired others. Chain 4A had vanished completely, not resolved, not transferred, simply no longer visible on our active local surface. I noticed it immediately. Where did 4A go? Marlowe checked the board and didn't look surprised. Away from us. That isn't an answer. It's the correct answer at this level. He sat, unsealed a protein bar from his jacket pocket, and broke it in half with the careful, resigned focus of a man eating, because the body still required fuel even when the soul had downgraded its expectations. He offered me the other piece. I took it. The wrapper was waxy with cold from his pocket, and the bar tasted like compressed dust and old chocolate. We ate in silence for a minute, watching the floor below us continue its patient industrial life. Then I said, "What was the closest you ever got?" He didn't pretend not to understand me. To proving anything. To understanding what the whole actually is. He chewed, swallowed, wiped his thumb against the wrapper. There was a week about 8 months ago, he said, where 3 things happened close enough together that I thought the machine had gotten sloppy. 1. Visible local volume came in high for 6 days straight with no corresponding increase in our formal burden. 2. A north-facing counterpart started appearing in language but not on any chart I could keep. 3. I got a transfer state in my visibility that belonged to a family nobody had ever trained me to pronounce aloud. I leaned forward slightly. What did you do? Counted. Compared. Asked one question too directly. To who? Wrong man. Right hallway. He didn't elaborate, and for once I didn't force it. Part of me wanted the hallway, the hour, the badge color, the name. A clean piece of story I could hold. Another part of me had begun to understand that clean pieces were how this place baited people who wanted the whole. What happened then? I asked after a moment. My routes improved. My review flags stopped sticking. 2 categories I kept seeing disappeared from local visibility for almost a month. And HR reached out to ask whether I'd considered transition planning before the next restructure cycle. The wrapper in his hand crackled once. Nothing dramatic, he said again. That's their best trick. They don't have to punish every curiosity. They just hard enough to teach it what doors become smoother when you stop touching the wrong handle. Down on the floor, one of the smaller transfer carts rolled into a screened lane and disappeared behind a retractable wall. Overhead, a lane light shifted from amber to blue. I pointed. What does blue mean there? Depends which family claimed it first. I laughed once before I could stop myself. Not because it was funny. Because my body had run out of better ways to express fatigue without admitting fear. Marlowe did not laugh. You think that's a joke, he said. I think it's a design failure. No, he said. Design failures get fixed if they cost the right people enough money. This is something else. That was one of the few times all night his voice shifted from tired to sharp. Not loud, just sharpened by conviction. I said nothing. After a moment he leaned back again, the edge gone. Look, he said. The dangerous thing is not that everything here is hidden. It isn't. Most of it is visible. Too much of it, even. Screens, labels, route codes, color states, binders, matrix notes, access qualifiers. The dangerous thing is that visibility here does not equal totality. People from outside think secrets live in locked rooms. Real secrets live in plain sight with enough adjacent nonsense to prevent synthesis. I looked at the strict desk again. My desk after midnight. Why stay so long, Ben? He followed my eyes. Because for years it still looked local from the right angle, he said. And once it stops looking local, you have to decide whether you're the kind of man who can work inside a part without needing the whole. And you're not. He smiled this time, but sadly enough that I wished he hadn't. No, he said. I'm exactly the kind of man who's bad at that. That's why you're getting my chair. The office clock turned 1007. On the board, a new route notice appeared and vanished so quickly I might have missed it if I had blinked. Temp white halves, Khan AUX. I stood before I realized I had done so. The chair legs scraped against the floor, too loud in the small control room. There. Again. Marlowe's eyes went to the board, then to me. Sit down. Sit down. You saw it. Sit down. What is Khan AUX? He held my gaze long enough that I understood, finally, that the question was no longer merely curious. It had crossed into a category of speech he believed could alter the room. It is a phrase, he said carefully, that does not improve your first night. That's not good enough. It has to be. Why? He stood too then, not aggressively, just because something about the exchange had made sitting incorrect. Because if I answer it the wrong way in the wrong office, then the answer becomes evidence that I gave you a map I wasn't supposed to give. And if I answer it the right way, you will think cargo is the next honest place to go. It isn't. Cargo isn't honest. Cargo is transition. Things enter it one thing and leave it another. That was the longest he had ever spoken about cargo, and the effect of it was not to scare me off. It was to make every instinct I had spent the last 3 hours disciplining itself against tighten into a single line of inquiry. He saw that happen on my face and closed his eyes briefly. There it is, he said. What? The moment I start losing you to the machine the same way it lost me. Before I could answer, his tablet chimed. Not the floorboard. His personal docked tablet. The sound was softer than the route alerts, almost polite, and somehow that made it worse. He looked down at it, and the expression on his face altered with such precision that I understood two things at once. He had been expecting something, and he had hoped not to get it tonight. What is it? I asked. He did not show me the screen. Midnight separation acknowledgement, he said. Meaning? Meaning I'm not the manager anymore. He set the tablet face down on the desk. You are. You are. The room changed in that instant more than it had when any route code blinked or vanished. Not fully see through it. Jurisdictionally. The same monitors hummed. The same route board glowed. The same strict desk waited beside me. But the lines around those objects had moved, and I was now inside them. He exhaled once, slow. All right, he said. Now you get the rest of the handoff. The bad part. There are jobs that train you to obey a hierarchy. There are jobs that train you to obey a floor. And then there are jobs like Paleosustenance Transfer, which train you to obey the boundary between what can be locally known and what can only be safely repeated. By 1:15 in the morning, Marlowe had stopped trying to keep those two categories from touching. The control room had gone quieter without becoming calm. The coffee machine clicked to itself in the corner. The monitors painted their little rectangles of authority across the glass. Below us, the floor kept moving with the same industrial patience it had shown before midnight, as if the change in my title were only another invisible wrapper state. He sat at the desk he no longer owned, his tablet face down, his shell unzipped, the tendons at the side of his neck standing out more clearly now that the role had been formally taken from him. I sat across from him in the chair that had become mine without gaining any of the authority a childish imagination once associates with furniture. Below us, the annex continued as if nothing of consequence had changed. Forklifts turned between wet lane markings. Scanner bands flashed white across sealed containers. Root tones chirped in their clipped little mechanical dialects. A sanitation worker dragged a hose across the floor and left a shining curve of water behind him. The floor knew nothing about inheritance. It only knew chain state. "All right," Marlowe said. "Bad part." He slid the legal pad toward me. Not the page with the visible manager counts. A fresh sheet. He uncapped a pen and drew 3 boxes in a row. In the first, he wrote, "What your job says." In the second, "What your floor does." In the third, "What the machine uses your floor for." Then he put the pen down. "Most people survive here by keeping those separate," he said. "You start having real trouble when you think they're supposed to line up. So tell me how they don't." "No? You tell me." It was an irritating management trick. The kind seminar people use when they want you to feel ownership over an answer they already prefer. Coming from him, though, it did not feel theatrical. It felt like the last available safety measure. I looked down at the 3 boxes. "What my job says," I began, "is that I manage receiving, local staging, and chain integrity confirmation within Annex Authority." "Good." "What my floor does," I hesitated. "Try again without the onboarding language." I looked through the glass, at the workers below, at the small, moving, disciplined world I had already started instinctively calling the floor, as if that noun could hold the whole problem. "It takes in volume," I said. "Stabilizes it. Translates it into categories the next layer can use. Holds and reroutes ambiguity until another family claims it." Marlowe nodded once. "Better." Now the third box. That was harder. Not because I didn't have thoughts, because the thoughts were beginning to arrange themselves into forms that no longer sounded professionally healthy when spoken aloud. "The machine uses the floor," I said slowly, "to create local certainty around things that may not actually be locally knowable." Marlowe leaned back in his chair and looked at me for several seconds without speaking. "There you are," he said quietly. I hated how much I wanted that to sound like approval. "That's why counting becomes addictive," he went on. "Because once you realize your node is producing certainty it can't verify in full, quantity starts looking like your last honest friend. And it isn't. No, it isn't. But it lies more slowly than language does. So men like us get sentimental about it." He stood and moved to the root board again. Not the main display this time. A smaller wall unit beside the side monitor I had taken for auxiliary scheduling earlier in the night. The unit sat behind a scratched panel of protective glass, its lower edge filmed with fingerprints and cleaner residue. He keyed in with a code I had not seen him use before, and a narrower root family view opened. The headings were stripped down, less guest-safe, less interpretively padded. Receive fee stage. Divert cross-claim temp fi as. Below that, a chain list populated in white text. No poetry. No brochure language. No herbivore program support. No non-standard nutritive. Just hard enough to upthing that glass. "I thought that surface was disabled for us," I said. "It is now." He said it without irony. Then, what am I looking at? My final use of a code they forgot to revoke before midnight separation acknowledgement. There was something so bleakly procedural about that sentence that I laughed once, and this time he did too, though only with his eyes. "You probably shouldn't be showing me this," I said. "Correct. Then why are you?" He kept his attention on the board. "Because you already crossed the more dangerous threshold." Which threshold? Believing the categories are decorative instead of constitutive. Once that happens, either I give you a cleaner shape or the machine does. That answer would have sounded melodramatic from almost anyone else. From him, it sounded like a man describing preventative maintenance on a bridge he no longer trusted. The list updated. 5 chains shifted state in quick succession. 1 held. 2 crossed into diverts. Another disappeared from the visible local surface entirely, and at the bottom, for less than 2 seconds before a claim mask overlaid it, a chain family notation flickered through that I had not been meant to see. CAUX Live, Temp White Halves, East Feed Transit. I stepped closer before I could stop myself. The old chair creaked behind me, and the office glass caught my reflection leaning toward the board like a man trying to read the weather in a storm warning. East Feed Transit. Not route support. Not adjacent receive. Feed Transit. The mask settled over it with a neutral gray bar. Not locally actionable. There it was again. The sentence that seemed to function less as a boundary than as a philosophy. East Feed Transit, I said. That's not a category that should exist on our visibility if the machine is really segmented the way they say. No, Marlowe said. So why did it? Bad routing. Wrong claim timing. Somebody assuming your node was a quieter place to let a request pass. Maybe none of that. And Carnorks? He exhaled through his nose. Carnivorous Auxiliary Live Support Family. The words hit the room strangely, not because they were shocking on their own, but because hearing them fully assembled made every previous partial appearance of the term feel retrospectively deliberate. Auxiliary to what? I asked. Exactly. Don't do that. I'm not doing anything. That's the problem with the phrase. Auxiliary can mean support, overflow, supplemental route, temporary burden redistribution, contingency intake, a dozen things. Depends who minted it. Depends who inherited it. Depends whether the machine is trying to sound smaller or larger than it is that week. And East Feed Transit? Not ours. You just said that means nothing. No, he said. I said it means something different from what sane people want it to mean. I stared at the board. The chain was gone now. Or rather, its visible version was gone. The absence remained in me like an unbalanced equation. How many feed transit families are there? More than you'll be told. Fewer than the infrastructure implies. You already used that answer once. That's because it keeps being the answer. Below us, on the actual floor, a root tone sounded 3 times in a pattern I hadn't heard yet. Not urgent, but distinct enough that 2 workers at opposite ends of the annex glanced at the same wall panel before returning to their stations. Their bodies knew the sound even if mine did not. What's that one? I asked. Cross-claim ready. Meaning one family has prepared a chain for release, but another family still wants ownership of the interpretation. Ownership of the interpretation. Yes. You hear how bad that sounds. Marlowe looked at me with an expression that might have been pity if pity were less tired. Simon, everything here sounds bad once you stop asking whether it sounds normal. The root tone stopped. On the narrowed board, a new entry populated. Chain 18. Divert hold, local vis O. Then, beneath it, a smaller note in white. Tempt DOC mismatch. Marlowe swore under his breath. Not dramatically. Automatically, like a man hearing a recurring leak in a wall he already knew was rotting behind paint. What? I asked. Nothing you need on your first. He stopped himself. Corrected. Nothing you should have on your first independent quarter hour. That wording alone told me more than he wanted it to. He moved fast for the first time that night, around the desk and to the side terminal where he keyed in a local visibility pull. The board brought up a document stack for chain 18, then rejected 2 of the files, then repopulated with only the local wrappers. I stepped beside him and read. The mismatch was almost insultingly small. Receiving family, specs bulk temporary root wrapper, not halt cross-reference marker, AUX slam eligible. 3 near-match categories sitting against the same movement state like different departments had all written over the same noun in pencil. That could just be paperwork slop, I said. Yes. Could. Yes. But. He glanced at me. But if chain 18 is the kind of thing I think it is, then somebody used a wrapper broad enough to move it under the wrong family's visibility without tripping the first layer of local refusal. What kind of thing is chain 18? He did not answer. Not evasively this time. Evaluatively. Why does that question scare you? I asked. He turned back to the screen. Because you're now asking the right version. On the board, the chain state pulsed once. Then a second line appeared beneath tempt DOC mismatch. Ye escort review it visit. Advised by whom? I said. System nudge. That's not a category. No. No. It's a survival instinct disguised as software. He pulled the root wrapper into a side pane and showed me what he meant. The escort recommendation wasn't a formal hold. Not an override. Not even a requirement. Just a confidence-weighted advisory generated from a conflict stack too messy for the first layer to resolve cleanly. It was exactly the sort of feature a large machine invents after enough expensive ambiguities have already hurt the wrong people. So what happens? I asked. If everybody's sane? Somebody with the right escort family comes down, claims the chain, and moves it out under cleaner authority. And if they don't? Then the local floor gets left holding a thing that isn't theirs long enough for curiosity to become labor. He heard what he had said a split second after I did. The room changed around it. Curiosity to become labor. That was the whole place, wasn't it? Not only for chains. For people. Has that happened before? I asked. Often enough. To you? Marlowe closed the side pane. The board returned to the chain list. That's how I ended up near cargo the first time, he said. He did not mean to say it. Or maybe he had meant to for hours, and only now understood that the sentence had finally found the right pressure to escape under. I said nothing. That was the only reason he kept going. Not because I went looking for the truth, he said. That story sounds too flattering. A chain went wrong, family ambiguous. No one with proper escort claim arrived in the useful window. Review wanted confirmation before release. Release wanted a local body attached for the handoff corridor because no one wanted ownership of the uncertainty. I said yes because it looked temporary, and because by then I still thought temporary was one of those words adults were allowed to trust. Where did it take you? Close enough. Close enough to what? He looked out through the glass toward the annex, but I knew he wasn't seeing the floor anymore. He was seeing some older corridor layered over it. To learn that there are smells your body understands before your language does, he said. And to learn that chain wrappers mean less the farther they travel from the room that printed them. That answer went through me like cold water. Not because it was explicit, because it wasn't. Because it suggested there were places in the machine where a category could remain technically valid long after the thing inside it had become morally obvious. The route board chimed again. Chain 18 shifted. Divert hold became temp escort attrated. And beneath it, just for a second before the visible local wrapper collapsed closed, EAST transit. There it was again. East. Feed transit. Not hours. Not locally actionable. Yet close enough to touch the edge of responsibility before disappearing. Marlowe reached over and blanked the narrow board manually. Why'd you do that? I asked. Because if I leave it visible, you'll keep reading it until your mind turns it into an obligation. Maybe it is one. No, he said. Then more quietly, that's how they take good managers apart here. They teach them that every visible edge is theirs to reconcile. It isn't. Some edges are only there to measure who can't stop leaning over them. We stood in silence for a few seconds. Below us the floor continued, patient and unembarrassed, taking in mass and producing local certainty by the pallet. Marlowe picked up his shell again and zipped it all the way this time. A gesture so final it made the room feel briefly ceremonial after all. I need to do one last walk as non-manager, he said. Paper wants signatures attached to a body before my access collapses all the way down to nostalgia. And me? He looked at the desk. My desk now. Then at the side monitor, where chain states kept changing whether anybody deserved to know them or not. You watch local visibility, he said. Only local visibility. If anything soft locks, reclassifies or cross-claims in a family you are actually cleared on, you log it and do not improvise interpretation. If something appears that's not your lane. I know. I know. No, he said. You know the sentence. I'm telling you the part beneath it. You do not follow it, just because the wrong thing stays visible long enough to make you feel chosen. That landed hard enough that I didn't answer. He must have seen that, because some of the edge left his face. 15 minutes, he said. Maybe 20. Then I summed the last of it, shake the wrong hands, and disappear into the sort of corporate mercy they call voluntary. He started toward the door, then stopped with one hand on the frame. Without turning back, he said, "If chain 18 survives in local view longer than it should, write the exact wrapper family sequence down before it changes. Don't memorize. Write. Memory gets too eager when it's frightened." Then he left. The office felt larger after that, which is one of the crueler things rooms can do. I could hear more of it once he was gone. The tick of the cooling monitor housing, the faint electrical whine from the root board, the distant clack of a scanner arm resetting below the glass. I sat in the chair and watched the main board, then the side terminal, then the reflected glass, then the floor below. For the first time all night, no older intelligence in the room was shaping what counted as the next useful question. There is a specific loneliness to inherited systems. Not being alone in them. Inheriting them. Receiving not just a role but the residue of another man's failed attempt to keep the machine local enough to survive. 5 minutes passed. Then 7. Nothing dramatic happened, which meant I became more alert with each passing minute. At 1:26, the side terminal pulsed. Not the main board. The narrower root family pane Marlowe had blanked. A white icon appeared in the corner, indicating incoming local visibility restoration on one unresolved chain state. I opened it before I had time to ask myself whether that was curiosity or simply the job. Chain 18. Hand 18. It had not cleared. It had not transferred cleanly. It had changed wrappers again. Specs bulk was gone. Nut halt remained. A new line had appeared beneath it. Tempt physical attach required. I stared at the words long enough that the cursor dimmed at the edge of the screen. Physical attach. Not escort attached. Not review advised. Physical attach. There was a route note beneath it, smaller and uglier because it was trying not to be. Local body ACC payable pending slam hand. I felt, with complete clarity, the exact moment my first independent quarter hour stopped being administrative. I have had enough management training in my life to know that the most dangerous sentence in any large system is usually the one that sounds temporary. Temporary hold. Temporary reroute. Temporary exception. Temporary labor attachment. The word exists to make the nervous system ashamed of reacting proportionally. I stared at the side terminal long enough for the screensaver threshold to think about me. The office around the display seemed to retreat. Strict desk, root board glow, legal pad, cold coffee, the glass overlooking a floor that still believed in movement. Chain 18. Nut alt temp fistical attach required. Below that, local body ACC payable pending slam handoff. And below even that, in smaller print that looked less like software than like a legal department trying to pass for software, unescorted hold ineligible after 01:32. I checked the office clock. 1027. 5 minutes. This is the point where, if I were a wiser man, I would tell you I immediately recognized the trap. I didn't. I recognized danger, yes, but in the wrong professional category. Not, this is how people get processed into the wrong machine state. More like this is the sort of messy edge case a newly separated manager cannot afford to mishandle on his first quarter hour alone. That distinction matters because it is the difference between fear and obligation. And systems like this survive by teaching you that obligation is the more adult emotion. I tried the local escalation tree first. That is important to say. I did not leap from suspicion to trespass. I behaved, for at least 4 minutes, exactly as the role had trained me to behave. I opened the local action pane. No owning claimant. No cleared escort family. No downstream destination release. One advisory nudge blinking at the lower edge. Attach body, hold local/await. Body. Not manager. Not local representative. Not floor authority. Body. I picked up the desk phone and dialed the extension marked for transfer liaison. The receiver was warm from its own little transformer, ordinary and greasy at the seam where other hands had held it. It rang 6 times and kicked me to an automated root state message. Transfer family response currently delayed under active claim conditions. If your chain is locally stable, preserve hold and await aligned family acknowledgement. I hung up before the message finished. Dialed the north-facing secondary line Marlowe had used once earlier. Nothing. Dialed floor lead. Ramirez answered on the second ring over a wash of industrial background noise. Receiving. It's Voss. I have chain 18 flagged temp physical attach with no escort family attached and an unescorted hold cutoff at 0132. A pause. Not confusion. Calculation. You're alone upstairs. Marlowe's on final walk. Of course he is. Do you know what 18 is? No, he said too fast. Then, more carefully, I know it's not local clean. That doesn't help me. It helps more than the wrong kind of help. I could hear metal rattle behind him, scanner chirps, the hollow amplified slap of something wet or chilled being moved onto a hard surface. Can you hold it where it is? He asked. System says unescorted hold ineligible after 132. Then local body it. There was that word again. You're saying that like it's normal. I'm saying it like it's survivable. That should have stopped me. In retrospect, that should have stopped me more thoroughly than any alarm could have. Survivable for who? I asked. Ramirez didn't answer. Instead, he said, did it give you corridor family? I looked back at the screen. Below the advisory block was a root token I had not noticed because the eye is drawn first to verbs that sound like responsibility. Might cargo. Itiransit. My stomach tightened very slightly and then, because the body is often ahead of character, a second time more honestly. East Transit. Again. Yes, I said. Another pause. Longer this time. Then write the full wrapper stack before it changes, Ramirez said. Every line. Paper, not memory. Marlowe had said the same thing. That is the sort of repetition that can feel like wisdom or contamination depending on when you hear it. I pulled the legal pad toward me and wrote exactly what I could see. Chain 18 not halt tempt physical attach required local body taste captable pending slanning salamentand. Of Toffusen courted hold ineligible after 0 hold ineligible after 0132 mide cargo / e-transit. Now what? I asked. Ramirez exhaled into the line. Now if you want the official answer, you preserve local contact until a claimant arrives. And the unofficial answer? There isn't one I'm interested in saying aloud. That's not good enough. No, he said. It isn't. But if chain 18 is what I think it might be, good enough stopped being an available standard before you picked up the phone. That sentence did something bad to the inside of my chest. What do you think it is? He lowered his voice, which was absurd, because lowering your voice on a phone line inside a building already listening to itself is an instinct, not a defense. I think somebody used a broad wrapper to keep a movement local visible long enough for a body to attach before proper family claim resolved. Meaning if the wrong thing is moving under the right temporary language, it can still become your labor before it becomes your knowledge. He ended the call after that. Not rudely. Like a man stepping away from the edge of a sentence he had already leaned too far over. I sat there with the phone still in my hand. This is the place in stories where a more dramatic protagonist does something immediate and cinematic. Runs. Defies protocol. Kicks open the wrong door, because the script has already decided the truth deserves him. Real systems do not feel like that from the inside. They feel administrative until the exact moment they don't, and by then your body is already attached to a decision you mistook for maturity. I keyed in a local acknowledgement to stop the hold clock from escalating automatically. The timer paused at 0131. Then the screen added another line. Body attach confirmed, local responsible until handoff. I had not moved. I had only acknowledged the chain. That was when I understood, in the flat procedural way some realizations arrive, that the machine had already accepted me as the body. Not because anyone had chosen me in a dramatic sense. Because the software, the timing, and the local node had converged into the sort of tiny bureaucratic fact from which larger harms are built. I stood so quickly the chair wheels struck the desk behind me. The route note expanded. Proceed mid cargo via local ACCs 3 maintain visual until slam. No override tone. No red alarm. Just a task. If you have never worked inside a place that hides danger inside plain assignment language, it may be hard to explain how much force a sentence like that can carry. Not imaginal force. Structural force. The sort that does not make you brave. Only compliant in increasingly elaborate ways. I told myself I was not going to follow it. That is true. I told myself I was going to check local access 3, verify the chain state physically, and call again from the corridor if the movement looked wrong. That is also true. Most bad decisions are built from overlapping truths. I took the pad page with the copied wrapper stack, put it in my shirt pocket, clipped my badge to the outer seam where it would remain visible, and left the office. The annex floor looks almost offensively normal from the stairs. Ramirez was nowhere in sight. A sanitation unit crossed between receiving lanes 3 and 4. One forklift reversed under a strobing safety arc. 2 workers argued mildly near chilled, holding over whether a scanner had eaten a destination note or merely refused to respect it. Nothing on the visible floor suggested that the machine had just translated me from manager into local body. Local access 3 sat off the secondary staging side, behind the corridor Marlowe had called the soft middle. Getting there meant passing out of the receiving floor noise and into a narrower service throat, where the floor paint thinned, the drains grew more frequent, and the air lost its wet straw warmth. The badge gate there was narrower than the others, with no amber hospitality glow, only white overhead strips and a wall panel listing 3 admissible states. Local attach slam handoff return unescorted not assumed. I read the last line twice. Not prohibited, not denied, not assumed. It is remarkable how efficiently institutions can make contingency sound like weather. My badge opened the gate. That should probably have been the end of my sense of safety. Instead, it increased it, because access has a way of flattering the person who receives it. You tell yourself if the badge opened, the task must still belong to your world. The corridor beyond was colder than the annex and narrower than anything guest-facing architecture would ever permit. Painted concrete, grated drainage, stainless bump rails, short-run strip lights set behind protective covers yellowed by years of cleaning chemicals. The walls carried old impact marks at cradle height and newer scuffs lower down where boots or wheels had corrected themselves too late. At intervals along the wall, route indicators glowed in different colors depending on which direction you faced them. Facing inward, amber. Facing deeper, blue-white. At the first junction, a small panel displayed. Mid cargo attach body, maintain left. That phrase again. Attach body. Not attached body. Not body attached. A command written in the clipped grammar of a machine that had no reason to care how human it sounded. The deeper I went, the less the building resembled a management problem, and the more it resembled a supply chain theology. Pipes. Chilled lines. Route curtains. Sealed side doors with alphanumeric family codes instead of names. Somewhere behind the walls, a pump or compressor throbbed steadily enough to start colonizing the pulse. I passed one cross corridor with a transparent panel in it and saw a transfer cradle roll through under escort from right to left. 3 workers in dark shells moved with it, one ahead, one beside, one trailing. No one looked at me, which was, in its way, more frightening than if they had challenged me. It meant my presence, at least at that altitude of the machine, still fits some available sentence. The second route panel sent me left again. Chain 18, local attach, ACTV. I followed the corridor into a low staging bay half the size of the annex office, and 10 times less honest. There were no scenic words here. No herbivore support, no non-standard nutritive. Just line markings on sealed concrete, one active root cradle under white light, and a wall screen showing chain state against a live countdown. 01-2914. The cradle sat waist-high, modular, locked at four corners. Outer shell stainless. Internal chamber obscured by thermal and privacy wrap. A route sleeve at the side displayed the same wrapper family stack I had copied upstairs, except one line had changed. Nut halt temp physical attach fistical. Local body present, slam, handoff pending e-transit, clearness rixted. There it was. The machine had already moved from body acceptable to body present because the body had entered the room. I felt something cold and profound settle into me, then not panic exactly, not yet, but the sensation of being grammatically outmatched. I stepped to the side of the cradle and looked through the narrow observation strip in the wrap. Inside were sealed nutrient containers nested around one central carrier unit, too small to be normal bulk and too heavily locked for ordinary specialty support. Condensation had gathered on the observation strip, and where I wiped it with my glove, the plastic squeaked softly, an intimate little sound that felt obscene in the empty bay. The carrier itself bore no readable label from this angle, only a hazard marker with the top half obscured under adhesive overlay. Below the overlay, I could see the tail of a printed word. Vor. Not herbivore. Too short for the visible fragment. My mouth went dry. That was the first moment the shape of the danger changed category in my mind, from administrative wrongness to biological wrongness. Not fully see-through at night. Just the body's older recognition that some containers are being protected from damage and some are protecting the room from what they contain. The countdown on the wall screen hit 01-2802. A new note populated beneath it. Handoff delayed proceed e-transit with local transit with local attach if slammed not receive. I stared at the words. Then at the cradle. Then back at the words. Proceed e-transit with local attach. Not stand by. Not await authority. Proceed. I reached for the wall phone. No dial tone. Only a local system prompt. Cross-family corridor currently under movement integrity preservation. Non-route calls unavailable during active attach state. Of course they were. I tried my cell phone next. No signal. Of course again. The cradle chimed once. At the far end of the bay, a segmented door rolled upward with mechanical reluctance, revealing a continuation corridor sloping slightly downward into colder light. Above it, the directional signage illuminated in white-blue. E-transit, local attach. That was the moment I should have broken with the task completely. Left the cradle. Walked back out. Accepted whatever administrative consequences followed. Instead, I did what the machine had spent 4 hours teaching me to do. I stayed with the chain because staying with the chain still looked more responsible than improvising disobedience. The cradle unlocked from the floor mounts with 4 synchronized clicks. Not free. Mobile. A handle assembly extended from the side rail. Not because the machine expected a person in the abstract. Because somewhere in its chain logic a local body had already been successfully attached, and the next state required movement. I heard Marlowe in my head then, not his literal voice so much as the structure of it. Not cargo. Cargo is transition. Things enter it one thing and leave it another. Too late for that. I had already entered. I took hold of the extended handle. The metal was colder than it should have been through my glove, and faintly textured for grip, as if someone had studied the exact moment a human hand would need to become part of cargo handling and made that moment ergonomically convenient. The cradle display acknowledged contact instantly. Local attach confirmed. Then, beneath it, the line I would think about later more than almost anything else from that night. Personnel status, not rote event. I don't know whether that line was meant for me. Maybe it was part of the carrier's internal logic. Maybe it was only surfacing because the system had layered too many family views over one another and briefly shown me a sentence built for a different class of operator. It doesn't matter. What matters is that I read it. And once I read it, the whole corridor rearranged itself in my mind. Not as a place I was escorting something through, but as a place where the machine had no meaningful reason to distinguish my body from the continuity of the transfer. A route tone sounded from deeper in E-Transit. 2 clipped notes. Then another. The cradle's wheel locks released. The corridor waited. And, with the count still moving on the wall behind me, I pushed chain 18 into the cold. Once you are inside the wrong process state, the hardest thing to recover is not safety. It is proportion. The corridor beyond E-Transit did not look like a place where men disappeared. That is perhaps the most offensive sentence in this whole story, but it is also true. It looked like a place where temperature, friction, timing, and physical burden had all been optimized by people who believed the best way to control danger was to deny it theatricality. The floor sloped gently down under the cradle wheels. The lights were colder than anything back in the annex, more blue-white than white, each one protected by caged housing and set far enough apart that the spaces between them remained conceptually useful to the shadows. Along the left side ran sealed access doors marked only by alphanumeric families and narrow inspection panels. Along the right side, insulated piping and root housings disappeared into concrete and re-emerged farther on in tight controlled bundles like nerves the building did not trust to remain exposed. The cradle moved well once it had momentum. Too well. Its wheels made almost no sound on the sealed floor, only a low, dense whisper beneath the steadier hum of the corridor systems. That quiet felt less like good maintenance than complicity. That was one of the first things I learned in E-Transit. A properly burdened system always feels more confident than the body accompanying it. Every 10 or 15 feet, a route panel lit as I approached and went dark after I passed. Local Atat, Attach Continue. Mantan Cant. Salem Handoff Delay Compensated. As though time itself had been rerouted around my discomfort. I kept one hand on the extended rail and the other near the emergency stop plate mounted to the side of the cradle. Though by then I had already realized the emergency stop was likely designed to preserve route integrity, not to restore my dignity. The machine read my contact through the glove. Every few yards the side display reasserted my role in the chain with calm, inhuman confidence. Local Attachits. Atadov. Personnel status not route relevant. I stopped reading it after the 3rd repetition, because repetition is one of the ways systems teach you what kind of despair they expect you to normalize. The corridor turned left, then right, then passed through a transparent pressure gate that opened only after the cradle's side tag and my visible badge had both been read in sequence. That mattered, not because it made me feel safe, because it meant the machine was not merely tolerating my presence. It was incorporating it. Beyond the pressure gate, the air changed again. The cold remained, but beneath it came something older and less industrial. Wet mineral. Heated protein. The high dirty green smell of concentrated vegetation or processed plant mass held too long near active systems. A vent above me ticked as it adjusted, and the new airflow moved against my face with a damp warmth the corridor had not earned. Under all of it, braided so tightly into the rest that for several seconds I could not separate it, was the rank warm musk of animal life scaled beyond what a human nervous system prefers to imagine in enclosed architecture. My pace slowed before I consciously decided to slow. The cradle did not resist. It simply adjusted the wheel drag, as if my fear were a variable already anticipated in the engineering. A root tone sounded ahead, not the clipped chirps from the annex. Lower. More directional. 3 notes descending. Then one held tone long enough to make the pipe housings along the wall seem briefly sympathetic. A panel ahead illuminated. BIOS XC threshold. Then beneath it, local attach maintain. And below even that, the sentence that finally made my body understand the corridor was not just leading downward in space. Do not break chain continuity. There are rules you can disagree with and still remain inside. That was not one of them. Because by then, breaking chain continuity had ceased sounding like an administrative failure and started sounding like the name the machine would give to a person's attempt to become a person again in the wrong place. The threshold gate opened with a hydraulic sigh so soft it might have been mistaken for luxury somewhere else. On the other side was a wider chamber, circular or near enough that the walls suggested curves even where the light refused to show them fully. Condensation crawled down the reinforced panels in uneven lines. The floor markings here changed from straight line guidance to nested arcs. 3 root channels fed into the chamber from different heights and angles. 2 were dark. The one I entered remained lit in blue-white. At the center of the chamber sat a transfer platform ringed by waist-high containment rails and 3 inactive cradle locks. Above it, suspended from a tracked armature, was a guide crane or lift assembly of the sort used when human hands are no longer considered an acceptable primary interface. And beyond the containment rails, set lower than the platform itself behind reinforced transparent barriers stained by old condensation and newer things, there was movement. Not clear enough to name. Not the full reveal some cheaper story would have spent 6,000 words promising. But movement large enough to disturb the shapes around it. A shift in dark mass behind the glass. Then another, lower to the ground than I expected, and faster than I liked. Something passed through one of the lit seams for half a second a flank, I think, or the rear sweep of a body built for sudden concentrated motion. The glass answered it with a soft percussive tremor, too deliberate to be impact and too heavy to be incidental contact. I stopped completely. The cradle did not. Or rather, it wanted not to. The wheels continued to urge forward under assisted guidance until the hand contact sensor registered my resistance and slowed with a subtle mechanical complaint. Local attach delay. The side screen flashed amber. Continuity. Warning. I heard myself laugh once. A short, dry, exhausted sound that might have been panic if panic had ever been willing to sound so bureaucratic. No, I said to no one. Absolutely not. My voice died in the chamber faster than it should have. The walls or the insulation or the sheer professional density of the place seemed to take human speech personally and deal with it accordingly. I reached for the emergency stop plate. Pressed. Nothing happened for 1 full second. Then the display changed. Manual interrupt read, registered. Below it, subvisory slam agents. And beneath that, local attach returns, continuity obligation. I hit it again, harder this time, as if force could make the sentence acknowledge its own obscenity. The display did not change. The central platform lit in a narrowing ring ahead of me, guiding the cradle into alignment. On the far wall of the chamber, another panel illuminated. EST Feed Transit, AUX Hold 2. There it was again. East. AUX. Feed Transit. And now, at last, the environment around the words had become specific enough that my professional mind and animal body could no longer maintain separate theories about what those syllables were for. I should tell this part carefully because horror invites exaggeration the same way wealth invites euphemism. I did not see a full dinosaur then. Not in the cinematic sense. I saw enough to destroy every remaining protective lie my mind had been trying to keep between category and consequence. As the cradle rolled onto the platform, something rose in the adjacent holding run behind the reinforced barrier and crossed one of the cleaner light seams at an angle. Ahead, but too narrow and alive in the wrong ways for the cartoon memory the word dinosaur still tries to bring with it in modern adults. An eye flash or reflection. Teeth, yes, but not displayed the way movies like to display them. Simply present in a mouth that opened briefly as if scenting or testing airflow. The body behind it remained mostly occluded by rail shadows, barrier supports, and geometry. But that almost made it worse. I could see enough of the neck and shoulder movement to understand that this was not a museum category, or a brand asset, or a family of protected intake states. It was a living predatory problem built inside a machine that had decided my personhood was not root relevant. The animal made no theatrical roar. What it did instead was produce a low, rough exhalation against the barrier seam, wet enough that the sound seemed to touch the glass before I saw the faint fog of it. Then it struck the reinforced glass once with the side of its jaw, or skull, not at me exactly. Not because I was special, but because movement had entered its world and movement mattered. The entire chamber answered with a structural hum. Lights shifted from blue-white to a harder white. A tone sounded overhead, not loud but final. Axe hull 2, aerosol even. I did not know that phrase then. I know it now because it burned itself into me on the way past. The cradle locks engaged around the lower frame with 3 metallic clacks. I was no longer merely accompanying the chain. I was standing beside something the room had accepted into position. Another message appeared on the side screen. Local attach standby for slammed transfer. Stand by. I looked around the chamber. No claimant. No escort family. No human being at all besides me. That was when I finally understood the exact species of trap I was in. Not simply that I had been routed somewhere dangerous. Worse than that, the machine had advanced me far enough into a claimed process to immobilize me with obligation, but not far enough into a human chain of custody to grant me rescue. I stepped backward from the cradle. The side display flashed amber red. Chain continuity, break risk. From deeper in the holding run, the animal moved again, this time faster. A slashing pass through shadow and light that revealed more of the body than before, lean, leg-heavy, built for close acceleration. The tail, or tail equivalent, balancing it with humiliating grace. Utah Raptor was the nearest phrase my later mind reached for, and even that feels contaminated by pre-existing fiction. What matters is not taxonomy. What matters is that the body was real, the barrier was real, and the distance between those facts and my assignment was being mediated by software that still thought the main problem in the room was continuity. The far side panel changed. Salame handoff delay extended. Then, local attach retweet main position. I backed up another step. The cradle alarm changed tone. Not louder, sharper. The platform rails remained locked. The adjacent holding run lights strobed once as the animal hit the barrier again, lower this time with enough force to make the platform tremble under my boots. That broke the spell. Not fear. The spell of administrative grammar. For the first time since the chain accepted me as local body, I stopped asking what the correct task was and started asking what in the room still acknowledged the difference between a task and a man. The answer was not much. There was the pressure gate behind me, now sealed, a side service hatch beside the guide armature, marked Authorized Maint Access in lettering too small to flatter anyone, and, tucked half below the platform edge, a manual release recess protected by a hinged safety cover. I moved to the recess first. Knelt. Tore the cover open. Inside was a red pull ring and 3 lines of text. For platform failish only chain. Loss risk ACC TED local injury not road compensable. I stared at the last line long enough to understand that it was not threatening me. It was simply telling the truth in a dialect nobody was meant to hear until it was too late to remain shocked by it. The chamber tone changed again. This time a new voice entered, automated, female, and so neutral it sounded almost tender until you listened to the content. Auxiliary hold claimant delayed. Local attach maintain position. Do not enter adjacent run. Barrier integrity is sufficient. Do not enter adjacent run. That was the first sentence all night that treated me like a body with a future attached to it. And because it arrived so late, I trusted it more than I should have. I pulled the red ring. The platform locks disengaged with a violent metallic crack. The cradle shuddered sideways 6 inches. Warning lights changed. The side display filled with text too fast to read, then froze on one sentence. Shine continuity broken. The chamber answered immediately. Not with freedom. With failure. Somewhere above, the guide armature jerked into motion and then stopped halfway through an automated correction cycle. One of the overhead lights blew out in a burst of white sparks. The pressure gate behind me remained sealed. The far panel went dark, then returned in emergency red, and in the adjacent holding run, The barrier lock at the service seams cycled once. Not open. Not fully see-through at night. But enough. The animal felt it before I understood it. Its whole body changed around that sound. The pacing stopped. The head came up. The next movement toward the service seam was not agitated impact anymore. It was directed interest. I left the cradle. That is what broke my continuity with the machine, and perhaps what saved my life. Not heroically. Not enough to break it. In the ugly, scrambling half-fall of a man who has finally understood that staying professionally near the problem is now indistinguishable from volunteering his own body as a component. I went for the maintenance hatch. It did not open on first pull. I slammed the plate latch with my palm, felt the sting run up through my wrist, pulled again. And this time it gave with a shriek of rubber seal and a cough of colder, dustier air from inside. Behind me, the chamber automated voice had given up on tenderness. Barrier anomaly. Barrier anomaly. Local attach clear zone. Too late for elegant obedience. I threw myself into the hatch corridor just as something hit the outer chamber floor hard enough to ring through the metal under my hands. Not the fully see-through at night. Or maybe the service seam, or the barrier edge, or a strike redirected by machinery. It doesn't matter. The sound was close enough to annihilate every remaining abstraction. The machine had brought me here under transfer logic. The animal had now entered the story under its own. I dragged the hatch mostly closed behind me, though not sealed. The maintenance corridor beyond was barely shoulder wide, all duct housings and insulated lines and emergency strips set knee-high instead of overhead. I could hear the chamber voice still repeating anomaly language through the imperfect seal, followed by the heavy directional impacts of something testing a room that had just changed its rules. For several seconds I knelt there on the metal grating, breathing through my mouth because the air smelled of coolant, dust, old lubricant, and the sharp animal taint that had followed me farther into the machine than any sentence should have been able to. Then the service strips ahead lit one by one. A route arrow appeared on the nearest war plate. MAINT Grislaw's North Recovery. Recovery. Not rescue. Not exit. Recovery. I laughed again, once, because by then the building and I had developed a shared sense of style. Then I got up and went deeper into maintenance, because survival, when it finally arrives, often still sounds like the wrong department. The maintenance corridor did not feel like escape. It felt like being rerouted into a less expensive kind of disappearance. That distinction matters, because survival, in places like R Epoch, is rarely delivered in the emotional language people want from it. It does not always feel like rescue or relief or even clean luck. Often it feels administrative. A side channel. A recovery state. Something the machine had always intended to make available in case the more elegant failure became too visible to manage. The passage marked MAINT, Dress, North Recovery ran narrower and longer than it had any right to. Every few yards the service strips lit ahead of me in cold succession, and died behind me just quickly enough to make the walk feel less like movement than like being consumed by a controlled idea of retreat. The grating underfoot gave way to sealed panel flooring, then back to grating, then to a rubberized anti-slip run streaked with old wear and fresher drag marks I did not stop to inspect too closely. Somewhere overhead, fluid moved through pipes with a slow intestinal confidence. Behind me, through walls and insulation and the thick, indifferent muscle of industrial architecture, the chamber kept speaking to itself. Barrier anomaly. Continuity failure. Claim delay extended. Not screams. Not disaster. Just the machine narrating my exit in the same dialect it had used to bring me there. At one bend, the corridor widened around a service junction full of line housings, emergency shutoffs, and a wall cabinet whose transparent face revealed breathing masks, sealant foam, trauma packs, and restraint loops arranged with the crisp confidence of things someone had once decided not to call panic equipment. Below them was a printed label, Recovery Catchin/North. Recovery again. Always recovery. Never rescue. I took one of the lights from the cabinet because the service strips ahead had begun to flicker, And because by then I trusted held objects more than language. The flashlight was heavier than a consumer model and designed for gloved hands. I noticed, absurdly, that it fit my grip better than most of the tools in the manager office had. Then I kept moving because the smell had changed. Not stronger exactly. Closer. Something of the chamber had found the corridor system with me. Not the full animal, I don't think. Not in any physically simple way. More like the air pathways between spaces had ceased to respect the categories the walls were supposed to enforce. Warm musk, sharp waste, protein heat, wet mineral. The living fact of a predatory environment threaded through maintenance infrastructure that wanted to pretend it was only carrying coolant and power. At the next hatch, I found a panel labeled NRCV Servid Return, and almost laughed from relief. North Receive. Back toward something legible. Back toward Annex logic. Back, at least, toward a world where men still pretended nouns belonged to the right things. The hatch would not open. The side panel flashed amber when I presented my badge. Manager local, return unescorted not assouved. Then imagine see-through at night. Not denied. Not prohibited. Not assumed. I swore at the panel, which changed nothing but improved my opinion of myself slightly. Then, below the badge plate, I saw the actual problem, a second sensor strip keyed to recovery status. Not access. Condition. The machine did not care that I was a manager. It cared what state I was in. By then my breathing had gone shallow in the stupid, disciplined way people breathe when they are trying not to spend too much oxygen on fear. I looked down at myself. Transfer grime on my sleeves. One hit. Zindirt streaked from the scramble into maintenance. Glove scuffed from the release pull. Shirt damp at the spine and underarms. No visible blood, which felt almost like an accusation. Then I understood what the panel wanted. Not proof of rank. Proof of incident. A small slot beneath the sensor plate bore a recessed instruction strip. Recovery return requires rectangle all. Of course it did. I reached into my shirt pocket and found the pad page I had copied in the office. The wrapper stack. Chain 18. My neat manager handwriting trying to hold a shape steady long enough for conscience to recognize it. Worthless here. Then I remembered the side tag attached to the cradle. Not the whole thing, just the detachable local root token clipped at the corner. I had torn it free without fully realizing I was doing it when I left the platform. It was still in my left pocket, bent and warm now from body heat. I pulled it out. The strip had partially delaminated where my hand must have crushed it during the scramble. But one code line remained readable. Local attachments active. E-transit. I fed it into the slot. The panel considered me. Too long. Then, recovery state AC septed. The hatch released. The relief that went through me then was so extreme it embarrassed me later. Not because I was wrong to feel it. Because the door opening felt, for one soft, reckless second, like the system had decided I was a person again. It hadn't. It had only decided I fit a different kind of process now. The service return opened into a receiving adjacent wash corridor bright enough to hurt. White walls. White drains. White overheads merciless in their refusal to stylize anything. The air smelled of bleach, hot plastic, and the mineral bite of water forced through lines of pressure. The sudden cleanliness of it made me feel more contaminated than the chamber had. 2 sanitation workers stood 40 feet down beside a rolling decon frame. One looked up, saw me, and froze. The other didn't freeze. He hit the wall alarm. Not a panic alarm. A route alarm. The sound it made was short, local, and humiliatingly procedural. I raised both hands immediately. "I'm from Annex C," I said. "Paleosustenance Transfer. I was attached to Chain 18 and got routed through East Transit under." The first worker took 3 steps back. The second did not move at all. He had already gone into the kind of stillness people in dangerous systems develop when motion becomes more legally meaningful than compassion. "Do not approach," he said. Reasonable. Cruel in the moment. Reasonable in the system. "I need a phone." Hold position. I am not in a mood to hear hold position. That was the closest I came all night to shouting. It came out strangled and drier than anger should have been. The worker did not react to my tone. That was almost the worst part. He looked me over once, not as a fellow human evaluating another, but as a man verifying whether I fit a recovery his training had described badly. Then he said, "Show visible route token." I held up the bent, local attach strip. Both men saw it and altered around it in the smallest possible ways. Not panic. Recognition. The look of people who had hoped not to see a certain paperwork shape on a living body and now had. One of them keyed a line into the wall unit. "North recovery to Annex C local," he said. "One returned attach." Repeat. "One returned attach." Returned attach. Not Magina. Not employee. Not Simon Voss. Returned attach. I would like to tell you that hearing myself described that way outraged me into some clarifying moral speech. It didn't. By then I was too tired and too recently almost dead for anything that elegant. Mostly it made me feel cold in an interior, permanent sense. The reply came through after a burst of static and corridor echo. Marlowe's voice. Not crisp anymore. Not managerial. Old with fear in it now, which I had not heard from him before. Confirm identity. The sanitation worker looked at me. I said, "Simon Voss. Annex C." A pause. Then Marlowe again, flatter now because he was forcing the fear back into a shape that could pass through institutional air. Confirm solo return. That took me a second. Then I understood. Not whether I had come back alone on foot. Whether the chain had returned with me. Whether the wrong thing had been allowed to complete the wrong route. "Solo," I said. The static on the line thickened. Somewhere beyond the corridor, through more walls than I cared to count, another local route tone sounded and was cut off midway. "Hold north recovery," Marlowe said. "Do not clear him to open floor." "I'll come. I'll come." The line died. The sanitation worker pointed, not at me, but at a painted square on the floor 3 yards away. Recovery stand. There was no point arguing. I stepped into it. The square was outlined in black and yellow and bore one printed legend at its center. E for return, wait for / wait for claim. Still not rescue. Still not relief. Just another stage in a machine that wanted every return legible in its own dialect first. They made me wait 12 minutes. I know because there was a wall clock, and because once you've spent a night inside an apparatus like that, counting time starts to feel like the last democratic act available to the mind. During those 12 minutes, nobody mistreated me. That is important. Nobody shouted. No one pointed a weapon. No one called security with theatrical aggression. The route alarm blinked above the wash corridor in a steady amber pulse, and every time it reflected off the white tile I felt the square around my feet become more official. They brought a thermal blanket and did not hand it to me directly. They set it at the edge of the square and told me I could pick it up if I stayed inside the outline. One worker asked whether I had visible breach contact. Another asked whether barrier compromise had occurred before or after manual continuity break. Their questions were clinically phrased and morally grotesque. I answered them because by then the questions themselves had become the price of being routed back toward human company. When Marlowe arrived, he did not look surprised to see me alive. That hurt in a way I cannot make nobler with hindsight. He looked relieved, yes, but not surprised. As if some part of him had already built a mental category for returned attach, and was now only checking whether the body inside it happened to be one he recognized. He came through the far hatch with 2 people from a family I didn't know, dark shells. No visible names, only compact credentials and the calm of workers whose job begins where other departments' language gives up. One of them took possession of the local attach strip from the sanitation unit without ever looking at me directly. The other looked at the wall console, then at Marlowe. "Chain continuity?" she asked. Marlowe answered before I could. "Broken in chamber." Barrier anomaly followed. Local body returned via maintenance recovery. The woman nodded as if that were ugly but not novel. Then she finally looked at me. Did you enter adjacent run? No. Not at first. Did adjacent run enter your space? I thought about the strike on the chamber floor, the seam cycle, the impacts through the hatch, the smell. Close enough, I said. She studied me for a second longer, then wrote something on her tablet. Whatever category she chose, it apparently did not improve my dignity. Marlowe stepped nearer, but not into the square. He kept his hands visible at his sides, which made me realize only then that every person in the corridor was behaving like the room still belonged to route logic more than to human intuition. Can you walk? He asked. Yes. Can you do it without getting dramatic? I almost smiled. Almost. Probably not elegantly. Elegance is a guest-facing standard. The sanitation worker nearest the wall unit made a sound that might have been the ghost of a laugh, and then looked embarrassed to have produced it. They transferred me after that. Not back to the office. Of course not. Once a system has reclassified you as an event return, it does not send you back to your desk, so you can think about what happened with the wrong amount of freedom. They moved me through North Recovery, then into a decon room, then into a medical evaluation bay that looked like a clinic designed by a company that believed suffering should be clean, reversible, and non-litigious. The lights there were softer than the wash corridor but somehow less kind. They took my badge, not harshly. Logged my clothing. Asked whether any fluid contact had occurred. Asked whether the carrier had vocalized before or after platform lock. Asked whether I had seen the claimant family. Asked whether I had initiated manual brake because of biological escalation or because of continuity distress. That last phrase stayed with me. Continuity distress. As if panic, when it happens in the wrong corridor, can be recoded as a process reaction. No one used the word dinosaur with me. No one used the word attack either. The language stayed precise in the way formal systems become precise when they want to preserve moral distance from what precision is doing for them. By dawn, I had been medically cleared, administratively contained, and professionally annihilated in at least 3 categories I was not high enough to see named. No one fired me. That would have been legible. No one threatened me. That too would have created a shape. Instead, I was told there had been a temporary cross-family root integrity failure during attach handling. That my actions, while understandable under emergent conditions, had taken place outside optimal continuity judgment. That a review would determine which parts of the sequence were attributable to documentation conflict, delayed claim resolution, and individual deviation under stress. Individual deviation under stress. There it was. The machine, already beginning the work of redistributing itself away from the fact that it had brought me into a predatory hold transfer chamber under a wrapper broad enough to sound temporarily normal. Marlowe came to see me once after the first wave of questions had burned itself out. He was back in the old shell, though the badge clipped to it no longer gave him the authority the shell implied. He stood in the doorway of the recovery room and looked older than he had in the office. Which is what happens when a man has spent years preparing someone for the edge case he hoped would not happen on his watch, and then sees it happen anyway. "You all right?" he asked. It was a stupid question and kind for exactly that reason. "No," I said. "Good. Means you're reading it correctly." He came in and sat beside the wall rather than beside the bed, leaving the kind of space people leave when contamination has not been ruled out in every meaningful sense. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then I said, "You knew something like that could happen." He rubbed at one eye with the heel of his hand. "I knew the machine could push a local body farther than a local body understood." That's a careful answer. Careful is what I have left. Was it punishment? He looked at me then. Properly looked. Do you need it to be? That made me angry enough to sit up despite the ache in my spine and shoulders. I need it to be one thing. You won't get that. Then, what was it? He exhaled. Maybe somebody wrapped the wrong chain in the right temporary language because they were rushed. Maybe a claimant family let local attach absorb the gap because that's cheaper than a delay they have to explain. Maybe someone farther up used the ambiguity as a pressure valve because the system teaches people to do that once they survive in it long enough. Maybe all of those are the same answer. He leaned forward, elbows on knees. That is what I've been trying to tell you since the parking lot. The machine is too segmented for the clean villain people want. It doesn't need one every night. It only needs enough places where a man can stop being root relevant before anyone in authority has to feel theatrical about it. I looked at the blanket over my legs, at my hands resting on top of it, at the faint grease shadow still under one thumbnail from the manual release ring. How many? I asked. He knew what I meant. Not how many managers. Not how many chains. How many living things inside a system no one below a certain altitude could totalize honestly. He smiled without humor. Still counting? Yes. Then you're going to have a bad life here. Here? That made him pause. Just long enough. In relation to it, he said. Which was the most truthful answer anyone gave me after the chamber. He stood to go. At the door he stopped and said without turning back, "They'll try to get you to narrate it as stress plus documentation ambiguity. Don't do the machine's work for it if you can help it." Then he left me there with the white walls, the recovery smell, and the dawning understanding that survival had not returned me to ordinary employment so much as converted me into a witness the institution would prefer to classify as procedural drift. I was not allowed back to Annex C that morning, or the next. My badge status changed twice before noon, first to restricted, then to review hold. HR sent 3 messages written by 3 different people and 1 legal department pretending to be a tone. Medical cleared me for ordinary cognition with limited exertion. Operations requested a statement. Then withdrew the request. Then sent a narrower one. Then replaced "what did you see" with "what sequence did you experience?" Sequence. Never seen. Never animal. Never person nearly fed into the wrong part of a prehistoric logistics theology. By then I had spent enough time in the margins of preview and travel coverage to know there were anonymous voices out there, already people whose employers and agreements had apparently decided silence counted as professionalism until conscience found a pseudonym. I had always read those pieces with the cautious interest you reserve for accounts that sound half like testimony and half like the beginning of a breakdown. By afternoon I understood the tone better than I wanted to. I had enough fragments to know 3 things and not enough to prove any of them cleanly. First, just hard enough to hang back glass, not verse, in a childish sense. Not because a mastermind had pointed at my name and chosen a sacrifice. Nothing so emotionally flattering. But because the conditions that converted me into local body were normal enough to exist as recoverable workflow. The machine had practice. Second, auxiliary carnivorous support families were real, though whether they reflected overflow burden, supplemental feeding, hidden distributed holding, or something worse remained beyond my altitude. Every answer I could partially infer widened the system faster than it explained it. Third, no one below a certain level could prove the total size of the fed machine honestly, because the truth was not merely hidden upward. It was braided sideways through claims, wrappers, temporary language, and family-specific visibility until quantity itself became a local superstition. That, in the end, is the part I still cannot make people feel properly. Not the chamber. Not the animal behind the glass. Not the platform locks or the barrier seam or the sentence about my status not being root relevant. Those are cinematic enough that the human mind can stage them, and staging is always a way of making horror feel finite. What remains infinite is the count. The possibility that a machine built to feed, root, supplement, hide, support, and rename can grow beyond any one node's ability to prove what it contains, and can still ask local men to attach their bodies to its moving edges, as if responsibility were the same thing as knowledge. They did not keep me. Not in the role. That would have been obscene in a visible way. They also did not exile me dramatically. No security escort, no screaming showdown, no final denunciation in a conference room. Just review status. Administrative limbo. The gradual smoothing away of my future until all available paths looked cleaner if they did not involve my return. It was, I think, their most merciful option, and perhaps their most efficient. I still have the copied wrapper stack from that night. The page folded 4 times now, the ink fainted the corners from sweat and time. It smells of nothing anymore, which bothers me more than it should. Some part of me expects the paper to retain bleach, cold metal, or the animal warmth that was never supposed to reach it. Chain 18 not halt, temp physical attach required, local body taste required, local bodied, tasi patal, pending slam handoff, unscorted, hold ineligible. After row 1. 32 might cargo/e-transit. That page is not proof of the whole. It is proof of a seam. A place where language widened just enough for a human being to fall through it without anybody above needing to call the event by its honest name. Sometimes I still think about the root note from the hatch. AMA, E-dress, Lorth recovery. Not rescue. Recovery. As if the system had always understood that some fraction of what it moved wrongly would occasionally come back out still breathing, and had already built a softer hallway for that outcome too. That may be the worst thing I know about R Epoch now. Not that it is cruel in some simple theatrical way. Not even that it is hiding animals or numbers or departments. It is that the machine is mature enough to anticipate human return from its own moral failures and still describe that return in language so clean it almost sounds responsible. I have tried more than once to count from the outside. Not the animals. That was vanity even from within. The families, the divisions, the support chains, the number of adjacent realities required to make one temporary local attached state possible at 1027 in the morning. I always fail in the same place. The point where visible structure turns lateral. The point where one term means one thing here and another thing 2 corridors over. The point where a question stops being numerical and becomes architectural. How big is a machine no one below it can totalize honestly? How many people can touch it without ever seeing the whole? How many returned attaches has it already absorbed into smoother language than mine? I do not know. I only know that when the wrong system state found me, it did not need to hate me. It barely needed to notice me. It only needed a local body. And for a few minutes in East Feed Transit, that was me. Thank you for listening. This was an R Epoch file about a feed transfer account that would not close, and a system willing to treat a person as the missing local body. Subscribe for more R Epoch stories. Do not accept the chain unless you know where it ends.